each further stage of education. They were battered by and succumbed to the values of the white capitalist system, and after being given salaries, they could then afford to sustain a style of life imported from outside. Access to knives and forks, three-piece suits, and pianos then further transformed their mentality. There is a famous West Indian Calaposian. Let me make sure I know what this word is. Disgusting. Tallypson. There it is. Please let me say it. Oh, it's a person. Oh wait, is it? It's Calaposian is a musician who sings calypso music. Oh, okay. Calypsian, sorry. Who in, oh my gosh, another word, satirizing his colonial school days, remarking that had he been a bright student, he would have learned more and turned out to be a fool. Unfortunately, the colonial school system educated far too many fools and clowns, fascinated by the ideas and way of life of the European capitalist class. Some reach a point of total estrangement from African conditions and the African way of life, and like the Balassi Dangnese of Senegal, they chirped happily that they were and would always be quote-unquote European. There is no getting away from the conclusion reached by the African educationalist Abu Maumotumai that, quote, colonial education corrupted and the thinking and the sensibility of the African and filled him with abnormal complexities, end quote. It followed that those who were Europeanized were to be extended de-Africanized as a consequence of the colonial education and the general atmosphere of the colonial life. Many examples are cited in present-day Africa of the insulting treatment of aspects of African culture in the colonial period, based on cultural imperialism and white racism. What is seldom commented upon is the fact that many Africans were the victims of fascism at the hands of the Portuguese and Spanish, at the hands of the Italians and the Vichy French regime, from a brief period in the late 1930s and the early 1940s, at the hands of the British and the Boers in South Africa throughout this century. The fascist colonial powers were slowed capitalist states, where the government police machinery united with the Catholic Church and the capitalists to suppress Portuguese and Spanish workers and peasants and to keep them ignorant. Understandably, the fascist colonialists wanted to do the same to Africa, working people, and in addition, they vented their racism on Africa, just as Schmittler had done on Jewish people.
But I will probably be back. I am driving home. I'm gonna crash into a Tesla.
What?
Have a great day.
I swear to God, you would love in e-reader. It's going. Thank you. Like some colonial administrations, that of the Italians in Libya disregarded the culture of the Africans. However, after the fascist Mussolini came to power, the disregard gave way to active hostility, especially in relations to the Arabic language and the Muslim religion. The Portuguese and Spanish had always shown contempt for African language and religion. Schools of kindergarten and primary level of Africans in Portuguese colonies were nothing but agencies for the spread of Portuguese language. Most schools were controlled by the Catholic Church as a reflection of the unity of church and state in fascist Portugal. In a little known fascist Spanish colonies in Guinea, Rio Manui, the small amount of education given to Africans was based on eliminating the use of local languages by the pupils and on instilling in their hearts, quote, the holy fear of God, end quote. Schools in colonial Africa were usually blessed with the names of saints and bestowed with the names of rulers, explorers, and governors from the colonizing powers. In Spanish Guinea, that practice was followed, resulting in the fact that Rio Manui children had to pass by Jose Antonio School, the equivalent of saying the Adolf Schmittler School if the region were German, for the school was named in honor of Jose Antonio and the founder of the Spanish Fascist Party. Another aspect of the colonial education and culture patterns which needs investigation in the manner of each European racism and contempt was expressed not only by hostility to African culture, but the patriotism and by praise of negative and static social features. There were many colonialists who wished to preserve let me look up this word, everybody. I don't know what is okay, communist. I swear to God, you would love, I think, an e-reader. Maybe I should look that up. I'm gonna look that up later. IU. Perpetuity, a bond or another security with no fixed maturity date, or a restriction, making an estate inalienable, perpetual, or for the period beyond certain limits by the law. Perpetuity. Okay. To preserve in perpetuity everything that was African, if it appeared quaint or intriguing to them. Such persons merely succeeded in cutting African life off from the potentially beneficial aspects of the international world. The excellent example is the kind of work done by Gabon by Albert, Sanschweizer, who was in charge of a dirty, unhygienic hospital with dogs, cats, and goats, and chicken running around under the guise of fitting into the African culture and environment. As late as 1959, a friend and a colleague of Albert defended his unsterile hospital in the following terms. There it is. Now, to the domestic animals at the hospital, people have been shocked by the informality with which animals and people mix, and although it is perhaps not always defensible or hygienic grounds, the mixture adds considerably to the charm of the place. The writer was a dental surgeon from New York who would obviously have had to fit if a goat or chicken had wandered into his New York surgery. He knew full and well that Schweizer's hospital, quote, the goats, dogs, and cats visit hospital wards teeming with microbial life of the most horrifying varieties, but he defended their inhabitation with Africans because that was part of the culture and charm that had to be preserved. In the educational sphere, the Belgians carried out a language policy which might appeal to contemporary nationalists, for they insisted that primary education should be in one of the 5 main African languages of the territory. However, in practice, we used that apparently progressive decision to seal decision to seal off one Congolese ethnic group from another and to cut the education off from a wider world of knowledge, because the missionaries translated into local languages only that which they thought desirable. The policy of mock respect for African culture reached its highest expression in South Africa in the notorious Bantu Education Act of 1953, which sought to promote the differences between Zulu, Satho, Xhosa, and Vendi, and so on. Differences which were part of the earlier stage of development and which would have been transcended if there were no European intervention, or if under white rules specific steps were not taken to maintain the anachronistic tribal entities. Is that anachronistic? Let me make sure. I'm gonna make sure. We're gonna look it up anyways. I'm reading. I like how I'm reading today. Not too fast, not too slow, I don't think. Anachronistic. It's anachronistic, I think. Anachronistic. So it's anachronistic, belonging or appropriate to a period other than that being portrayed. Okay, anachronistic tribal entities. Not all colonial educators and administrators were cautiously taking up the position that Africans should be educated, the better to be enslaved. On the contrary, most of them thought that they were doing Africans a great favor, and there were a few who were enlightened enough to realize that there was scopes of devising a school program which was less divorced from African reality. In 1928, even the French education minister was shocked to learn that Africans were taught that the Gauls their ancestors had blue eyes. From the 1920s, both Britain and France produced colonial educators and education commissions which urged greater relevance to teaching programs in Africa. They also put forward suggestions such as the use of local language in primary schools, more educations for girls, and an end to the white-collar orientations of schooling. However, the seemingly progressive nature of those recommendations could not change the fact that colonial education was an instrument to serve the European capitalist class in its exploitation of Africa. Whatever colonial educators thought or did could not change that basic fact. To recommend that African girls should go to school is more than just an educational policy. It was a tremendous social implication, and its purposes that the society will usefully employ the educated woman. Metropolitan capitalist societies itself had failed to liberate women, to offer them equal educational opportunities, or to provide them with responsible jobs at equal rates of pay with men. That being the case, it was wishful thinking to imagine that the colonial educational system would take any serious interest in African women, especially since the colonialists would have had to transform the consciousness on that matter, which was characteristics of feudal and pre-feudal societies. Nowhere did the cash crops economy or the export of basic ores make provisions for educated women. As in the capitalist metropoles, it was assumed that the civil service was for men. Therefore, the extremely limited employment sector in the colonies had nothing to offer educated women, and modern education remained a luxury with which a few African women came into contact. Another progressive suggestion made by some colonial educationists was for more agricultural and technical schooling. But genuine technical education was ruled out because the fundamental purpose of colonial economy did not permit the development of industry and skills within Africa. Only in rare cases, such as in the Congo, was there an objective necessity for technically trained Africans. In the later stages of colonial rule in Congo, mineral exploitation had developed to such a point that there was practical need for extensive rudimentary technical skills among African workers. A few Congolese and other Congolese, one with a K, Congolanans, also received technical training for the secondary equivalent. Significantly enough, in such cases, the private companies took the initiative since their profits were at stake, and the technical schools were extensions of their production process. However, for the most part, whatever skilled jobs needed to be done within the restricted fields of mining and industry in Africa were met by a proportion of Europeans. Agriculture was not carried on as a scientific industry as in Scandinavia or New Zealand. Their whites were farming on the intensive capitalist basis. And as noted earlier, the production of cash crops in Africa was stimulated by the minimum expenditures on the part of Europeans and with no infusion of the new technology. All right, I'm gonna look back real quick. Probably nothing. Nope, nothing. Therefore, when educational advisors suggested agriculture education relevant to African needs, this meant no addition to African knowledge. In many colonial schools, agriculture became an apology for a subject. It was part of the drudgery of the institutions. The teachers received no agricultural education, and therefore they could not teach anything scientific. Children acquired nothing but distaste for the heavy labor of shamba work, and in fact it was used as a form of punishment. Earlier educational commissions also accorded high priority to religious and moral favoring of instructions, something that was disappearing in Europe itself. The role of the Christian church in the educational process obviously needed special attention. The Christian missionaries were as much part of the colonizing forces as were the explorers, traders, and soldiers. There may be room for arguing whether in a given colony the missionaries brought the other colonialist forces or vice versa. But there is no doubt the fact that missionaries were agents of colonialism in a practical sense, whether or not they saw themselves in that light. The imperialist adventurer Sir Henry Johnston disliked missionaries, but he conceded in praise of them that, quote, each mission station is an exercise of colonization, end quote. In Europe, the church had long held a monopoly over schooling from feudal times right into the capitalist era. But the late 19th century, that situation was changing in Europe. But as far as the European colonizers were concerned, the church was free to handle the colonial educational system in Africa. The strengths and weaknesses of that schooling were very much to the attributed to the church. Both inside and outside the church and school, the personnel of the church were instrumental to setting values during the colonial epoch. They taught an ethic of human relations that in itself could appeal to the finer instincts of Africans, just as it had previously stirred other Europeans. Of course, there was a huge gap between European conduct and Christian principles, with which they were associated, and on the part of the Africans, it was also true that motivates for accepting Christianity often had nothing to do with the content of the religion. Hold on a second, everybody. Oh my gosh. There we are. Hi, Rufus. I love you too. Indeed, the church as a source of education was probably more attractive to many converts than the church as a dispensary of religion. Whatever the church taught in any capacity may be considered as a contribution to formal and informal education in colonial Africa, and its teaching must be placed within a social context. The church's role was primarily to preserve the social relations of colonialism, as an extension of the role it played in preserving the social relations of capitalism in Europe. Therefore, the Christian church stressed humility, docility, and acceptance. Ever since the day of slavery in the West Indies, the church had been brought in on conditions that it should not excite the African slaves with doctrines of equality before God. And in those days, they taught slaves to sing that all things were bright and beautiful, and that the slave masters in his castles was to be accepted as God's works, as God works, just like the slave living in a miserable hovel and working 20 hours per day under the whip. Similarly, in colonial Africa, churches could be relied upon to preach turning the other cheek in face of exploitation, and they drove home the message that everything would be right in the next world. Only the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa was openly racist, but all others were racist in so far as their European personnel were no different from other whites who had imbibed racism and cultural imperialism as a consequence of the provision of the previous centuries of contact between Europeans and the rest of the world. The surviving in serving colonialism, the church often took up the role of arbiter of what was culturally correct. African ancestral beliefs were equated with the devil, who was black anyway. And that's the whole thing of Christianity. White is pure, black is a curse. And that's why Christianity is racist. And it took a very long time before European churchmen accepted prevailing African beliefs as constituting religion rather than mere witchcraft and magic. However, in its hostilities towards African culture, the religious manifestations, the Christian church did perform certain progressive tasks. Practices such as killing twins and trial by ordeal were frowned upon by the European missionaries, and those were reflections of superstitious ideas rooted in the earlier stages of African development, when something like the birth of twins could not be scientifically explained and therefore gave rise to religious fear. It is to be noted that in West Africa, long before the colonial scramble, many outcasts in societies and persons who suffered from religious and social prejudice were the first converts of the Christian church. What was supported by one section of the population was opposed by another, and in the present century, the cultural imperialism of the church excited great opposition. Prevailing African customs such as polygamy. Let me make sure I have this word right. Oh my God. What is going on? There we go. My computer wouldn't work. This computer is kind of slow, but it's all good. There we go. Polygamy. Okay, cool. Such as polygamy were attacked without reference to their socioeconomic functions. One of the questions of monogamy. Is that monogamy? We're gonna about to look up monogamy. If I'm even saying it right. Monogamy. Jesus Christ. Monogamy. The Christian missionaries were introducing not a religious principle, but rather a facet of European capitalist society. For their propaganda to have been seen successful, European activity had to work and transformation in the extended family patterns of African society. That was very slow in occurring, and in the meanwhile, many Africans accepted the religious aspects while rejecting the cultural appendages of the European missionaries themselves. Much has been written about the trends of colonial Africa, known as the independent church movement. It was a trend in which thousands of African Christians participated by breaking away from European churches, especially Protestant churches, and setting up their own places of worship under Christian African leadership. The motives were varied. Some independent churches were highly nationalistic, like that established by John Chilabiwi, who led the armed nationalist uprising in Naziland, Malawi in 1917. Others developed a response to those African aspiring to be priests and pastors, to discrimination practices against them by white missionaries. One constant factor was discussed with the way that Europeans forced Africans to identify as Europeans. Revolting against that concept on Zulu Independent Church put the question to the local population, quote, "Are we a Jewish or a Zulu? Were you were there when they crucified their Lord?" Nevertheless, many Africans came to accept the dehumanizing principles and alienation from self. African identification with Europeans, be they Gentile or Jewish, was a pillar of a informal education of the colonial epoch. In the final analysis, perhaps the most important principle of colonial education was that capitalist individualism. Like many aspects of the superstructure of belief in society, it had both its negative and positive sides. Viewed historically, the European bourgeoisie were progressive when they defended the individuals from the excessive control of the father and the family and against the collective regulations of the church and feudal society. However, the capitalist system then went on to champion and protect the rights of individual property owners against the rights of the mass of exploited workers and peasants. When capitalism had its impact in Africa in the colonial period, the idea of individualism was already in its reactionary phase. It was no longer serving to liberate the majority, but rather to enslave the majority for the benefits of a few. When individualism was applied to the land, it meant that the notion of private ownership and the transfer of land through sale became prevalent in some parts of the continent. Much more widespread was the new understanding that individual labor should benefit the person concerned and not some wider collective, such as a clan or ethnic group. Thus, the practice of collective labor and egalitarian social distribution gave way to accumulative tendencies. Superficially, it appeared that individualism brought progress. Some individuals owned large coffee, cocoa, and cotton shambas, and others rose to some prominence in colonial administration through education. As individuals, they had improved their lot, and they became models of achievement within society. Any model of achievement is an educational model that directs the thoughts and actions of young and old in the society. The model for personal achievement under colonialism was really a model for the falling apart and the underdevelopment of African society taken as a whole. It is a common myth within capitalist thought that the individual, through drive and hard work, can become a capitalist. In the United States, it is usual to refer to an individual like John D. Rockefeller, Sir, as someone who rose, quote, from rags to riches, end quote. To complete the moral of the Rockefeller success story, it would be necessary to fill in the details of all the millions of people who had to be exploited in order for one man to become a multimillionaire. The acquisition of wealth is not due to hard work alone, or the Africans working as slaves in America and the West Indies would have been the wealthiest group in the world. The individualism or the capitalist must be seen against the hard and unrewarded work of the masses. The idea of individualism was more destructive in colonial Africa than it was in the metropolitan capitalist society. In the latter, it could be said that the rise of the bourgeois class directly benefited the working class through promoting technology and raising the standard of living. But in Africa, colonialism did not bring those benefits. It merely intensified the rate of exploitation in African labor and continued to export the surplus. In Europe, individualism led to entrepreneurship and inventorism of the type which spearheaded Europe's conquest of the rest of the world. In Africa, both the formal school system and the informal value system of colonialism destroyed social solidarity. Let me make sure, solidarity, and promoted the worst form of alienated individualism without social responsibility. That delayed the political process through which the society tried to regain its independence. Up to this point, it has consistently been held that development is rooted in the material environment, in the techniques of production, and in the social relations derived from people's work. There are what are known as, quote, conspiracy theories of history, end quote, by which the happenings of whole epochs are presented as being a secret skimming of one group or another. Such an approach is not to be recommended in the study of Africa's relations with Europe. However, with regard to colonial education policies, one comes closest to finding the elements of conscious planning by a group of Europeans to control the destiny of millions of Africans over the considerable period of time extending into the future. The planning of colonial education for subjugation of Africa was most fully displayed by the French, because French politicians and administrators had the habit of openly expressing their thoughts on Africa. Therefore, the words of the French colonialists themselves will be cited here to illustrate how the colonial education system did not leave vital political matters to chance, but was consciously carrying out policies hostile to the regaining of freedom of African people. Ever since the period of imperialist scramble for Africa, French leaders realized that it was imperative to start some schools in the part of Africa claimed by France, that some French language and culture might be accepted by some Africans, who would then identify with France rather than Britain or Portugal or some other European rival. This was particularly true in disputed frontier zones. Eugene Anteny, a French minister at the start of the colonial era, stated that the extension of the French language was necessary as, quote, a measure of national defense, end quote. As earlier as 1884, there was a set of alliance Française as all instruments of educational and cultural imperialism, recognized and supported by the French government. The reports of the Alliance Française, this is all French, showed clearly that they thought of themselves as an arm of French imperialism, fighting so that France could entrench itself. For example, the Alliance Francaise wrote French schools of Upper Guinea in the late 19th centuries. Here's what they said: they have to combat the redoubtable influence of the English schools in Sierra Leone in this region. Their struggles between the two languages becomes more intense as one moves to the south, invaded by English natives and by their Methodist pastors. As soon as seen earlier, as the case of Portugal and Spain, the spread of language of the European colonizing power was considered a major importance. Belgium, on the other hand, encouraged local languages as a means of division of slowing down. Only in Tanganyika, under German rule, was there a positive reaction to the potentialities of Swahili as a teaching language, so that there was a full impetus of that language, which was already spread by trade, politics, at relations and personal contacts. Apart from language, the pillar of cultural imperialism in most colonies was religion. The church never played as important a role in French colonies as it did in other parts of Africa colonized by predominantly Catholic countries, and the Protestant churches in British colonies also had a much more vital role than the church in French Africa. The explanation is that the French bourgeois revolution of the 18th century was more thoroughly anti-clerical than any other bourgeois revolution in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church was completely separated from the government of France in 1905 after many years of poor relations. Nevertheless, when the French saw the mission schools were helping England to entrench itself in Africa, the French government asked the aid of their own Catholic Church to secure national interests. From the viewpoint of the colonized, once the frontiers of the colonies were firmly decided, the major problem remained that of securing African compliance in carrying out policies favorable to the metropoles. There was always a possible use of force for that purpose, but naked force was best kept in reserve rather than utilized for everyday affairs. Only education could lay the basis for a smooth functioning colonial administration. In the first place, there was an elementary language problem of Europeans communicating with Africans. Most of the time, Europeans used translators to pass on orders, but it was known that African translators seized the opportunity to promote themselves and to modify or even sabotage orders. There was a saying in French colonial Africa that, quote, translation is equal to treason, end quote. And the only way to avoid that was to teach the masses of the people French. When there was a practical aspect of educating Africans to be better workers, just as the workers received education so that they could be more efficient in producing extra surplus for the capitalists. In colonial Africa, the European bourgeoisie realized that some education could maximize the value of labor. Albert Strauss, a French colonial minister, stressed in 1914 that he termed, quote, the economic utility of education, the African masses, educating the African masses, end quote. Several years earlier, the French had made a specific statement to the same effect in Madagascar. An ordinance of 1899 indicated that the purpose of schooling was, here it is, before I say it, hey, what's up? Oh, I gotta do a puzzle piece. Let me let's see if I missed anything, everybody. Doesn't look like I missed anything. Yep, didn't miss anything. But welcome, Carrot. To make a young Malagasy faithful and obedient subject of Franco, and to offer an education which would be industrial, agricultural, and commercial, so as to ensure that the settlers and various public services of the colony can meet their personal requirements. So again, just like here, they put people through school to be better workers, not to evolve and develop their human capacities to the full potential. In practice, it was not necessary to educate the masses because only a minority of the African population entered the colonial economy in such a way that their performance could be enhanced by education. Indeed, the French concentrated on selecting a small minority who would be thoroughly subjected to French cultural imperialism and who would aid France in administering its vast African colonial possession. William Ponty, an earlier governor general of French West Africa, spoke in terms of forming, quote, an elite of young people destined to aid our own efforts, end quote. In 1990, Henry Simmons, then colonial minister, outlined a program of secondary education in Africa with a view to, quote, make the best indigenous element into complete Frenchmen, end quote. The best expression of the political implications of French colonial educational policies came in the 1930s, and by that time, some action was also matching the words. Brevet, the Governor General of French West Africa in 1930, urged the extension of the higher levels of primary schooling for Africans, quote, to help us in our work of colonization, end quote. Brevet was encouraged by the fact that by then there had appeared, quote, a native elite of those zeal for a thorough exclusive French culture signs are already visible. So with the support of the Inspector General of Education, the governor went on to outline plans for African students to attend secondary school so as to become colonial cadres. Any social political system needs its cadres. That was the role played by the youngest age grades in Shaka's armies, and it was the role played by the Komsomol, or the young communists of the Soviet Union. Being a cadre involved not just training for a practical job, but also political orientation to serve as the leading element in the system. The French and other colonialists understood this very well. This is how Brevet expressed it. This is how he expressed it. It is in no wise merely a matter of turning out hatchets of apprentices, clerks, and officials according to the fluctuating needs of the moment. The role of these native cadres is much wider. All right, I'm gonna look ahead just real quick to see how close, because I'm hitting my halfway. Well, that sucks. So I'm gonna hit a stopping point, but I don't know. Maybe it'll be a stopping point then. All right. Here's what they said. It isn't. Oh wait, I already read that. Only in North Africa, with its heavy white settler population, did the French find it unnecessary to encourage a local elite to run affairs under the direction of their metropoles, and the governor, although even in Algeria there emerged a number of subjects called the Banu Aou, literally the yes men, end quote, who always assented To carry, oh, let me make sure that's words right. It's always the easiest words that get me. I think I overestimate or, come on. No, that's the wrong one. That's the wrong one. Come on. I didn't do that. Come on, stop. Yeah, assented to carry out French instructions in opposition to the interests of the most of their brothers. Another far-sighted aspect of French political policies in the education spheres is the manner in which they forced the sons of chiefs to acquire education. It was the deliberate attempt to capture the loyalty of those persons who had previously held political power in independent Africa, and it was an attempt to continuity with the pre-colonial phase, as the French themselves put it by educating the sons of traditional rulers. Quote, a bond is thus established between the native cadres formed by us and those that of the native community recognizes. In 1935, the team of British educationalists visited French Africa, and they admitted with a mixture of jealousy and admiration that France had succeeded in creating an elite of Africans in the image of Frenchmen, an elite that was helping to perpetuate French colonial rule. To greater and lesser extent, all colonial power produced similar cadres to manage and buttress their colonial empires in Africa and elsewhere. After the Second World War, it became obvious that colonial rule could not forever be maintained in the same form in Africa. Asia already having broken loose, and Africa being relentless. When the awareness that the end was in sight becoming generalized, the metropolitan powers turned their colonial cadres and handed to them the reins of policy and political independent Africa. It should be emphasized that the choice that Africa should be free was not made by colonial powers, but by the people of Africa. Nevertheless, the changeover from colonialism to what is known as neocolonialism did have a climate of conspiracy in it. In 1960s, when the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan made a quote, an oft-quoted statement that, quote, a wind of change was blowing across Africa, end quote. That was a bourgeois way of expressing that Chinese Premier Zhao Enlai was soon to assert, namely that, quote, Africa is ripe for revolution, end quote. In order to delay or hijack the African Revolution, the colonizing powers turned to a group which they had already created for a different purpose. The elite of colonially educated Africans, from among whom were selected wherever possible those who were most suitable for elevation to political leadership and the administration of military apparatus, were left in the hands of similar trustworthy cadres. There were a few far-sighted Europeans who all along saw that the colonial educational system would serve them if and when political independence was regained in Africa. For instance, Pierre Funcin, a founder of the Alliance Francaise, started at the beginning of the century that, quote, it is necessary to attach the colonies to the metropoles by the very solid psychological bond against the day when their progressive emancipation ends in the form of federations, as is probable that they be and they remain French. in language, thought, and spirit, end quote. Yet it was the British who first appreciated that they would bow to the inevitability of grant African independence, while the French introduced a new African representatives into their whole parliament in France, so as to try to keep African territories tied to France. The British began to prepare to hand over to certain selected Africans. In the metropolitan capitalist countries, there were and still are elite schools which provide the bulk of the political and other leadership. In England, the English public schools of Eton, Harrow, Rugby, and Winchester, are well known as training grounds of the British ruling class, and by many authorities they are considered more important than the universities to which the students of such secondary schools invariably go. In France, at the secondary level, it was and still is usually to find that students emerging from places like the LYCEE, Louis L. de Grand, and the École Normale Supérieure, another college in France, are the future cabinet ministers and top executives of that country. In the United States, in spite of the myth that everyone can reach the top, a high proportion of the ruling class went to exclusive schools like the private boys' school like Groton, St. Paul, St. Mark's, and Phillips Exeter, EXETER. Under African conditions, anyone who went to schools in the colonial period virtually entered the elite because the numbers enjoying the privilege even at the primary level were so small. In addition, within each colony, there tended to be at least one secondary school or higher institution, which played the role of furnishing the political administrative personnel of Africa in the era of political independence. The names of cabinet ministers and permanent secretaries of individual African countries can be found on the school rolls of Gordon's College, Sudan, Alliance High School, Kenya, King's College, Bandung, Uganda, Tabaro Secondary School, Tanzania, Livingstonia, Malawi, William Ponty, Senegal, Sierra Leone Grammar School, Ghana, the Lai Galani, Madagascar, and a few others. Besides, there were Mercury, Foray Bay, and Achumato as long-standing universities or near university institutions. In retrospect, it is now very clear that one of the most significant aspects of the colonial educational system was that, provided by some armed forces and police, colonial armies such as the King's African Rifles and the French Free Army and the Congolese Force Publique produced sergeants who later became the majors and generals of independent Africa, and in several instances the heads of states. Policemen also achieved similar rapid promotions, although their political positions has been rather weaker than the military proper. Like their civilian counterparts, the future police and military elites were at one time trained to be simply low-level assistants to the colonial overlords. But once independence was in sight, they were judged by the colonizers to have a requisite qualities of colonial cadres, fit fit to be part of the ruling class in neo-colonial Africa. In a few instances, the colonial powers towards the latter part of the colonial period rushed to train a few Africans at the metropolitan higher institutions of scientific violence, notably Sandhurst Military Academy and Hedon Police School, Britain, and Saints SYR Military Academy in France. Those few who were selected for such training because the cream of the military elite correspond to those African civilians who went to universities rather in Africa or abroad. Most of what emerged from the colonial educational system was quite unique. Educational systems are designed to function as proper to a given society, and the education of the young age. The education in the young age groups automatically carry over their values when their turn comes to make decisions in society. In Africa, the colonialists were training low-level administrators, teachers, NCOs, and railroad booking clerks for the preservation of colonial relations. And it is not surprising that such individuals would carry over colonial values into the period after independence was regained. The colonialists, meanwhile, took action wherever possible to ensure that persons most favorable to their positions continued to man African administrations and assume new political and state police powers. Such a presentation of events would be termed one-sided by many Europeans and Africans too. In a sense, that is true, and the one-sidedness is deliberate. It is a presentation of what the colonial educational system achieved in terms of what it set itself to achieve. The other side of the matter is not the good with which colonial educators can be credited, but rather the good that emerged in spite of the efforts and intentions of the colonizers and because of the struggles of African people. 20 minutes. Let's look back real quick. Hey, what's up, Two-Spirit? What's up, everybody? Whoever decided to stay. F the French for sure. Yes, F the French. All right, sweet. Development of contradictions. The only positive development in colonialism was when it ended. It is the purpose of this section to sketch briefly how that development came about, with particular reference to the role of the educated sector, in contrast to subjective interpretations of what was good about colonialism on the one hand and what was bad on the other hand. There is an approach which follows closely the aims of achievements of the colonizers and the counter aims and achievements of the African people. Sometimes Africans were restricted merely to manipulate colonial institutions as best as they could. But in addition, certain fundamental contradictions arose within colonial society, and they could only be resolved by Africans regaining their sovereignty as a people. Analysis based on the perception of contradictions is a characteristic of Marxism. Thus, Soviet historians approach the disintegration of colonialism within the following framework. Colonialism fettered the development of the enslaved peoples to facilitate colonial exploitation, and imperialists deliberately hampering economic and cultural progress in the colonies, preserved and restored absolute forms of social relations, and fomented discourse between nationalities and tribes. However, the drive for super profits dictated development of the extractive industries, plantations, and capitalist farms, and the building of ports, railways, and roads in the colonies. In consequence, social change took place in the colonies, irrespective of the will of the colonialists. New social forces emerged: an industrial and agricultural proletariat, a national bourgeoisie, and an intelligentsia. Thank you. Although among the different segments of the African population within a so-called modern sector produced by capitalist activity, the cash crop peasantry was the largest. African cash crop farmers had profound grievances against the colonialists, centering on the low price of African products and sometimes on land alienation. Agricultural wage earners and urban workers had definitely lost their land and were resisting wage slavery. They did so by organizing as European proletariat had been doing since its formation, and by virtue of impact organization. African workers made their presence felt much more strongly than their limited numbers might otherwise have warranted. In the end, the numerical preponderance of the peasants and of those who had one foot in the subsistence, quote-unquote, sector was registered in the mass parties. But while peasants depended upon sporadic revolts and boycotts to express their grievances, wage earners were engaged in a more continuous progress of bargaining, petitioning, and striking. The smallest of the social groups was that of the educated elites and intelligentsias. As noted earlier, the number of Africans receiving education in the colonial period was so small that anyone who went to school was privileged and belonged to an elite. There were only a few lawyers and doctors concentrated mainly in North and West Africa. Generally speaking, the intelligentsias were students, clerks, and teachers. The educated also overlapped with that of organized labor leadership, with the traditional African ruling stratum, with ex-servicemen and police, and with traders and independent craftsmen. Altogether, the educated played a role in African independence struggles far out the proportion of their numbers, because they took it upon themselves and were called upon to articulate the interests of all Africans. They were also required to provide the political organization that would combine all the contradictions of colonialism and focus on the main contradiction, which was that between the colony and the metropole. The contradictions between the educated and the colonialist was not the most profound. Ultimately, it was possible for the colonizers to withdraw and to satisfy the aspirations of most of the African intelligentsia without in any way reviving the peasants and working majority, who were the most exploited and the most oppressed. However, while the difference lasts between the colonizers and the African educated, they were deceived. It has already been argued at some length that colonial education reached a limited number of Africans, that it was restricted to elementary levels, and that its pedagogical and ideological functions was such as to serve the interest of Europe rather than Africa. Even so, the number enrolled would have been much smaller were it not for efforts on the part of Africans themselves. Secondary school opportunities would have been narrower, and the ideological content would have been more negative. In the activities of the African masses were not in constant contradictions to the aims of European colonizers. Above all, education for continued enslavement never quit, fulfilled its purpose. Instead of different levels of contradictions arose, leading to independence, and in some cases, heralding a new socialist epic by the end of colonialism. If there is anything glorious about the history of African colonial education, it lies not in the crumbs which were dropped by European exploiters, but in the tremendous vigor displayed by Africans in the mastering of principles of the system that had mastered them. In most colonies, there was an initial period of indifference towards school education, but once it was understood that schooling represented one of the few avenues of advance within colonial society, it became a question of Africans clamoring and pushing the colonialists much further than they intended to go. When Africans took great pains to enter the cash crop economy, they generally suited European capitalist ends. But Africans' initiatives in the sphere of education was producing results antagonistic to at least some of the purposes of colonial exploitation. Education in French colonial Africa has been referred to several times from the viewpoint of French policy. French administrators also commented on African efforts to go beyond the limited numbers of cadres that the French had in mind, and whom the French were prepared to subsidize out of African taxes. In 1930, the Governor General of French West Africa reported, each new school that is opened is immediately filled to overflowing. Everywhere, natives in their multitudes are clamoring to be educated. Here, a chief wants a school of his own, so he builds it. Or again, some village or other may offer to hear the cost of fitting out a school. At certain places on the Ivory Coast, the villagers pay the teachers out of their own pockets. Our pupils often come from distances of 20 to 50 kilometers. And that's the end of that one. African enthusiasm in seeking more and higher education was not confined to any part of the continent, although in some parts it was manifested that at an earlier date and more intensely. For instance, the Gold Coast in Sierra Leone had a tradition of European education going back to the 17th century. Therefore, it was not at all surprising that in 1824, the Times Educational Supplement commented that there was a universal demand for better and more education on the Gold Coast. It was the Gold Coast which produced J.E.K. Agre, that distinguished African educator and nationalist, and he fired the imagination of Africans well beyond the Gold Coast insofar as formal education was concerned. There was a definite correlation. I can't say it. Let me look up this word real quick. I know the word, I just can't say it. My mouth won't let me say it. There it is. Correlation between the degree of colonial exploitation and the amount of social services provided. That applies to education in particular, so that urban, mining, and cash crop areas had a virtual monopoly of schools. That was partly due to the capitalist policies of enhancing the labor power of workers. Holy crap. But it was also the consequences of efforts made by Africans inside the cash economy. they made demands on the colonial administration, and they also went through a great deal of sacrifice and self-denial to get more schools placed. Thus, one finds that Ibos, who were earning income from palm oil, deployed a significant portion of their small earnings into building schools, usually in association with the church. Incidentally, it should be noted here that what were called church or mission schools were often entirely financed by Africans. They paid church dues. They made donations for the church harvest. They sometimes contributed to special education funds, and they often paid school fees. Jesus Christ. That pattern was widespread in Igbo land, and it was not uncommon in other parts of colonial Africa. The existence of schools should be traced through the church, back to palm oil and the people's labor. Indeed, it must not be forgotten that missionaries, administrators, white settlers, the whole lot, were living off African labor and resources. Jesus. So the Africans paid for it with their resources and stuff. That's wild. Thank you. Let's see here. I want to see how far I have. Real quick. Because that looks like a good stopping point. We got 5 more minutes. Just looking ahead. That might be a good stopping point. 5 minutes early. Well, let's see. Hold on. Oh my God. I thought I put... There it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Yep, I can't finish this chapter today. Alright, looks like we're going to finish the chapter tomorrow. Maybe even the book. I don't know about the book, though. The postscript. Oh, maybe the book. There's questions and answers in the back. Okay, I think that might be a good stopping point. Seems like one. If not, I'll just go back a couple paragraphs and read it. Just to make sure. All right. What page? We stopped on 324. I read a little slower today because they saw me kind of trip up and slow down, and I do a lot of reading. I read for about an hour and a half. I read Linen Selected Works for about an hour and a half, and I'm reading this for about an hour and a half. Well, that's a lot of reading. That's what? That's like 3 hours of reading. Jesus. Wait, 6:30, 7:30. Yeah, hour and a half. So, well, actually, 3, 4, yes. Yeah, so an hour and a half. So, all right. So, one of the biggest things that come through is like the even during the neo-colonial periods, they still I'm going to say groomed Africans in order to take over, to still be connected to the metropoles, and to still do the things for the exploitation of the colonial, being neo-colonial. And then the other thing was, one of the biggest things I took away is Africans were paying for the schoolings through their labor, and paying for European schoolings through their labor. This is still going down the lines that Africans developed Europe. And Europe hardly did anything for the Africans besides developing individuals to do the administrations of their colonies, basically. Yeah, I know, speed isn't important. I guess my flow was a little off. There we go. But yeah, so like education, and the thing is like to a certain degree here too, we still are being educated and indoctrinated to say that capitalism is good, and if you just work hard, blah blah blah. If you just, we're also being, but not to the extent of being exploited like in Africa or like in the colonies and stuff, like in neo-colonies and shit. So, yeah, and the fact that they had to go, and they also talked about the schoolings that create leaders. Like white leaders, white imperialists and shit. So that's cool. And then the very few that still go to and engage in European colleges, So they still are making leadership in order to engage in the imperialist dominations of their economies and shit. So, but anybody? Long watch time. All right, I gotta check something real quick, everybody. Hold on. All right. If no one wants to come up, no one has any questions, I'll go ahead and close it out. Anybody have any questions in the chat? You can say no. It's fine. No is fine answer too. All right, I'll give it a minute, just in case. All right, cool.